Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the Conference on Asian Pacific American Leadership's Washington Leadership Program. My name is Baunia Mua. I use she, her pronouns, and I am on the board of directors for CAPAL. The Conference on Asian Pacific American Leadership, CAPAL, is a nonprofit organization that builds Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander public service leaders by providing formative professional experiences and growth opportunities. It is my pleasure to be introducing our Washington Leadership Program with you today. WLP is one of our signature programs that introduces students to Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander leaders in public service who can inform and inspire students on civic engagement. Our WLP theme this year is Reflection and Resiliency, emphasizing the ability of communities to come together and catalyze momentous change through these unforeseen times. Through these sessions, panelists and attendees will reflect upon events leading up to 2021, emphasizing how communities unite to reflect and demonstrate unyielding tenacity and resilience, even in the face of uncertain and demanding circumstances. All WLP sessions will be recorded and live streamed to our Facebook page and will be available for later viewing afterward, including materials. I would like to welcome you to today's session, Environmental Racism. How did we get here? This session will focus on the uneven impact of environmental issues on communities across the US. Key topics of discussion will address the unequal effects of COVID-19, raise questions about who gets access to basic resources, such as clean water and air, as well as the prevalence of food deserts across the country. Topics will also address how the AANHPI community specifically is affected by these phenomena. Follow and join our conversation tonight on social media using the hashtag #WeAreCapal and tag us at CapalDC. There will also be a short survey that will pop up after we close the session, and we would greatly appreciate your feedback. And now, with that said, I would like to begin by thanking our speakers and panelists this evening for spending their time with us and to you all for joining us. And a very special thank you to our 2021 sponsor for making programs like tonight's possible at CAPAL. Tonight's program will consist of a self-care activity, a panel discussion, and Q&A. Please submit any questions you have into the Q&A box, and we will close out afterwards. And now I am pleased to introduce Hannah to set the stage for our panel with a map activity.
Hello, Vanya. Thank you so much for that introduction. My name is Hannah Park. I am the Programs and Operations Associate at CAPAL, and so excited and thrilled to have you here with us tonight. So I'm very quickly going to drop a link into the chat, which you all will see very shortly. And I will ask if everybody who is attending in the audience, if you all will be able to navigate to that link. Feel free to open it up on your phone, tablet, laptop, whatever is most convenient. And I will go ahead and share my screen here. And when you open up the link, it should take you to this website. So just very briefly looking at this website, you will see that it is a map that looks a little bit different than the maps that you all may be used to seeing. When you zoom in, some of the names may be familiar or maybe unfamiliar. I know for myself, this is definitely something new for myself, but essentially this map shows all of the indigenous and native lands and territories that you're on. So I'll ask that once you navigate to this page, if you are able to go and to the left-hand search bar right here, you're able to actually put in your current location. So as a disclaimer, if you don't feel comfortable putting in your current address, totally feel free to put in your zip code, city, etc. And once you enter that in, it'll zoom in and show you whose land or territory you're on. So as a very quick example, I'm currently calling in from Atlanta, Georgia. So it'll zoom in and then take me and show me the land that I am currently on. So apologies in advance if I butcher this name, but for myself, I am on Muskogee or Creek land. So I'll ask if everyone would like to enter in your location where you're calling in from, and then put down in the chat the name of the territory or the land, essentially your results into the chat, and then we can see where everyone is calling in from. So I'll pause here and give people a few minutes. Oh, and also feel free to introduce yourselves as well, to put down in the chat everyone's results, and then we can go through and see where everyone's calling in from. It'll be really interesting to see sort of any similarities, patterns, and things like that. So I'll pause here and give people a few moments to enter in their results. And just as a very quick side note, as people are doing that, just want to note that, so before we dive into this discussion surrounding environmental racism and inequality, it's really interesting to kind of see and reflect upon these underlying fundamental questions and issues that we still face today, such as whose land or resources are we actually on? I can say from a very personal perspective that I honestly have never really deeply thought about or critically reflected upon whose land I'm actually on. When I think about that, I usually think about my postal address. So it's really interesting to see some of the underlying questions and issues that we still face today, and how our histories in terms of who gets access, who gets ownership, has affected and shaped our communities today. And to give some more background about this, mapping project and this organization. This map is actually courtesy of the Canadian nonprofit organization Native Land Digital, and their work, they do really amazing work, essentially just striving to create and foster conversations about the history of colonialism, Indigenous ways of knowing, and settler Indigenous relations through providing educational resources such as this map, as well as their territory acknowledgement guide. And again, once you enter in your address, for example, here for myself on the side of the screen, you can see that a number of links will appear with different nation names. So when you click on those links, it'll actually take you to a page that specifically talks about that nation or language or treaty, where you can then view some sources, give feedback, and learn a little bit more. So I'll pause here, take a look at the chat and see if we're able to maybe zoom in and see a little bit of where people are calling in from. Okay, so we have Northern New Jersey, Washington, DC, Centerville, Virginia. We have New York, so we have a lot of Northeast. We have Seattle and Saponi. Oh, okay, we start from the West Coast, Sacramento, California as well. So just zooming out, it's really interesting to see where everyone's calling in from, but also just looking at the wide variety and plethora of lands, languages, just communities that exist within the US, but also showing that there is this long, complex history and conversations that need to be had in terms of the environment and how these past events have shaped where our communities are today. So definitely encourage you to check out their website and their work and this map some more when you have a chance. Again, just very interesting to see all of the diverse communities and lands that are here. And yeah, so I will pause here and hand it back to Vania. And feel free to keep on putting your results in the chat as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Hannah. And thank you for that super informative activity. I really love seeing where everyone is coming from, as well as which land you are currently living on. And now I'm super excited to hear more from our panel for tonight's discussion. Now the moment we all have been waiting for. Please give a warm welcome to Vic, who will be our moderator for this panel. Vic will be leading the discussion and the Q&A. Vic Vong is Greenlining's 2020-2021 Environmental Equity Fellow, centering communities on the front lines of climate change through proactive and targeted investments in social and built infrastructure. Vic is a sociologist and policy analyst hailing from occupied Duwamish land, also called Seattle. Using their expertise on holistic community engagement, Vic is currently advising the City of Santa Cruz on integrating equity into their 2030 climate action plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Vic brings expertise in advancing environmental equity through grassroots organizing, community-based organizations, and federal agencies. During the 2019 crisis, Vic experienced and witnessed how public health crises multiplied existing racial and social disparities. Vic's other interests include making environmental justice memes, seeing how plants and animals, including humans, change over time, and smelling flowers. Vic, the floor is yours.
Hello. Thank you for the very kind introduction, Banya. I'm super thrilled for our panel today. Fun fact, I was an intern in 2016 and I actually attended this session my year, and it was one of the reasons why I started my journey into environmental advocacy. And it was one of the first times I really saw a really specific focus on the multiracial movement that environmental justice has been. And that it's been led by Black folks, and that we all have a role in it, and we're all impacted by it, and we all influence it. Yeah, that's why I'm super thrilled to be back. We also have a really stellar lineup today. And I'll take a moment here to allow our panelists to introduce themselves. And they will share, number one, their name, number two, their pronouns if they're comfortable, number three, their position, number four, the work that they do, and number five, if they can share briefly, why do you do this work? And so we are gonna go in order. So I will hand it off to you and hand it back to me, and I'll tap on the next person. So the first person up is Rosette. Please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Vic. It's funny because I also started my journey with Kapal. I used to work for Kapal as their fall project assistant. And I feel like since then, my journey towards environmental justice has basically started. My name is Rosette De Castro. My pronouns are she, her. I am currently an international government relations specialist at Ocean Conservancy. We're headquartered in Washington, DC. I may be forgetting some of the other questions that I should be sharing. What else am I missing, Vic?
Just want to know, why do you do this work?
Well, I think for me, as a Filipino American and also first generation immigrant, I feel like at some point in our lives, environmental justice touches on our lives. I mean, for me too, like this sense of like home and belonging is tied into also places that we were, disbarred from being in. So for me, the work matters because it's for my community, it's for myself, it's for my family. And as we enter into like, hopefully a more caring, abolitionist world, then I hope to also add my part into it. Pass it on back to you, Vic.
Thank you so much, Rosette. It's great to meet you and to hear about your journey. Next up, we have Destiny. Please take it away.
Cool. Hi, y'all. So glad to be here with you all, and panelists too, and also participants. So my name is Destiny Mack, and my pronouns are she, her. And my role currently within the Sunrise Movement, the organization that I organize with, is the Justice, Equity, Anti-Oppression Organizational Manager. And yeah, but that work looks like doing political education within inside of the organization, as well as like supporting different forms of like feedback and implementation of change inside of the organization. So yeah, and I originally got into organizing through trainings and through like education of like why we need a Green New Deal and why like climate change is like a issue that like no matter who you are or where you come from impacts you and will always impact if you don't do anything about it. So that's where I got into it and why I do this work.
Thank you so much, Destiny. Thank you for your introduction. Love getting to meet y'all and to learn a little bit more too about each person, in addition to the audience getting to know you. Next up, we have Lynette.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Lynette Pham, she, her pronouns. I'm Vietnamese, Cebuano, and Kanaka Maoli. I'm currently on unceded Lower Tanana Dene lands in Alaska. I work as a rural regional field organizer with Planned Parenthood Alaska Advocates, and that's what I do for my job. But in my time in my life, I'm a community organizer with Fireweed Collective. Between these two things, I work between the intersectionalities of health, climate, and equity, mainly within rural Alaska and BIPOC communities. And I do this work because of my obligation to protect the lands and waters I live on that provide me food, shelter, and safety, and to work with the indigenous people who have stewarded these lands for thousands of years. These issues impact my community, and it is the way I can participate in community care. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynette. And next we have Leilani. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Leilani Menuda. I use they and she pronouns. And I'm just scrolling up to the list so I know I have it. I wear multiple hats. My day job is an environmental educator and environmental program manager for K through transition age youth here in San Francisco at the Chrissy Field Center, which is a department within the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy. My focus is within intersectional environmentalism, specifically teaching environmental justice and racial justice within environmentalism, telling untold stories. That's really important to me, and that's what I do day to day. But outside of my day job, I do a lot of Filipino-American solidarity organizing and international solidarity organizing, specifically with an environmental and racial justice lens. So what's been taking up more of my time recently is working serving as the co-chair for the Filipino-American Coalition for Environmental Solidarity. Other organizations that I partnered with, and kind of like how I came to here, my bridge to Kapal is through OCA Asian Pacific American Advocates. Alphabet soup, as many of y'all might know in the organizing world. Again, OCA Asian Pacific American Advocates. And that's kind of where I've got my foot into legislative advocacy. But the reason that I do this work starts way back for me as like a young person. I grew up in a working class family. I grew up in laundromats with my grandma because it was the work that she could get, and she didn't know that she had workers' rights or that labor rights existed for her. And she essentially worked up until the day that she passed away, and she passed away young at like in her 60s. And I think that economic justice and racial justice are very heavily a part of environmental justice. And if we don't address that, then it's not true environmental justice. Had my grandmother known that healthcare or that the conditions that she was working in within laundromats and in service industries, had those properly been had the information properly been afforded to her as I was growing up, she may not have died as early. She may have been able to take care of herself much better in the long run, and had better working conditions, and also set up generational wealth for her family. Not that wealth is the end game, but it's definitely a measurement of how well our communities are doing in today's society. So the reason that I do this is very deeply rooted in who's raised me and where I've grown up. And I still see so many people with similar experiences to my own, or young people who have experiences similar to my own, and immigrant families, families who come from neighborhoods who are under-resourced or very much neglected by the city or by state government. So that's my why.
Thank you so much, Leilani. It was wonderful to hear a little bit from each person, and I'm hearing some threads, what was life like for our panelists like growing up, but also what was the relationship of, our individual experiences or our community's experiences with societal conditions. And that's really, close to home for me because I do this work because I care. I think for me, my reason was partially because I don't know if folks know, but Seattle was a red-lined city And so that meant that the government intentionally decided who could live where, and we did that in partnership with real estate agents based on who was allowed to live on the most healthy land, and who was going to live near the industries and other polluting things like that. But also, like, you know, in terms of international imperialism, who gets displaced for oil, who gets displaced for those different things. And so I'm really, stunned, honored to share space with y'all. And I hope for anyone in the audience to know that, like, there's such a breadth of experiences and work jobs, and also, like, you know, outside of work, organizing and otherwise. So no matter where you are, wherever you end up in your career, environmental justice can still be a priority and something that you work on. And sometimes it's easier to work on when you're not doing it at a job. So it really depends, but hoping folks feel, you know, that there is a possibility for their own relationship to this. There always is. So transitioning a bit, we're about to start the panel questions, and I'll just share a bit of background about the history before we dive into, you know, zooming in to our panelists' areas of work, since they work specifically with different communities. And so to share some context, the environmental justice movement was born in Warren County, North Carolina. And it was a situation where there were rural, poor, and mostly Black residents who demonstrated. Over 500 demonstrators were arrested while protesting the siting of a hazardous landfill. And this helped invigorate a movement that was also at the time like faith-based. Some of the studies came out of the church. And the study that came out was called Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, 1987. And that was the first like official document to directly make the correlation that it isn't just, you know, poverty and pollution. It's not just because you're poor that you live near hazardous landfills. It's also specifically because of the targeting of Black communities and the ways in which people were dehumanized. And so that first national study linking race and hazardous waste siting set off a movement and really challenge folks to think beyond like white mainstream environmentalism. Sometimes people think of polar bears, sometimes people think of like the ice caps. What people may not realize is that in the same city, in the same communities, there are disparities, and those disparities are intentional. They're not just, you know, a natural consequence, they're actually part of planning. And so as we move forward, that understanding means that it needs to be race conscious. It can't just be like an afterthought or actually worsen the disparity. And also the beauty of it is that it was a multiracial gathering of people who established the National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, storytelling and agreements, and internationally, so that it wasn't just like a siloed approach to protecting one community, but then allowing another community to have that landfill rerouted to them. And so we're really witnessing, I'm getting goosebumps talking about it. We're really witnessing like, you know, power. And so since we have these amazing panelists today, I'll be asking them, you know, what is it like today to work on environmental justice? And since we've seen so much in the past 2 years, COVID-19 crisis, racial protests for racial justice, anti-Black violence and anti-Asian violence, and multiple both environmental justice wins led by Native folks, particularly in Seattle, but also elsewhere. I wanted to ask, you know, for those who are working on the ground as organizers, what are the impacts that you have seen in your line of work, whether it's like COVID-19 rollouts and how that's related to the environmental access, or mutual aid, and just wanted to hear a bit about what that's been like for you and what you've seen. So first, I wanted to see if Lynette, you wanted to answer this question.
Could you read the question one more time?
Absolutely. What has the last year or two been like in terms of how your community has been impacted? And that could be the COVID-19 crisis, and that could also be, you know, wildfires or other or droughts or floods, other ways that the environment has affected your communities.
Thank you. Yeah, I have been a climate justice organizer since maybe I was in grade school because of how close Alaska is to climate change. And so I'm from the Aleutian chain, from a community called Unalaska, Unangak lands. And my parents immigrated to America and were working on the fishing industry. And so I had spent my entire childhood, my entire life living on a fishing plant. And they were trying to open up this giant mine up the river, up the way, that would pollute all the water. And so to me, my whole life, the fishing industry is what brought me life. It brought me shelter. It brought me my family. It brought me to this place that I had lived on and, learned many things, participated in so much culture and love. And I would consider my rural community an immigrant community. And so during the pandemic, I really saw that because there is like a lack of like people able to immigrate back from their countries to go back and work on the fishing industry. It had impacted all of the families who do live there, and it impacted all of their families that these, if you're from a diaspora, you can relate that someone in your family comes to America, they send money back to their family, and that just wasn't possible. And so what mutual aid looked like in Alaska was many times of asking for money, mutual aid developments. Something that a lot of communities rely on is our marine highway. And before we had giant budget cuts that cut these. And so this is the only way island communities like Vine can get food. And so all in the lower 48, so Alaska's north, we call the rest lower 48. Without the food workers being able to go to work, our communities didn't have food in our grocery stores, and a lot of things were left blank. And for a lot of us, we don't have like a hospital or a clinic. And so getting sick with COVID means that you have to fly out to one of the larger communities. And for me, that's 1,000 miles away is the closest hospital. And so when you think about the impacts, the people who live in these communities, these rural communities, are indigenous people. They're Filipino immigrants, Samoan immigrants from all over the world. And to the point where during the winter, our vaccines are still delivered by sled dog. And you think about, where does our food come from? And it comes from all the truck drivers. It comes from planes, boats, and even things like if the ice breaks up in different parts of the winter, then we can't deliver food to communities through river. We can't deliver communities through plane because of the runways are filled with snow. And so it looked like pretty much our entire state ensuring that people would survive. And it took everyone, every single organization. Yeah, so I'll stop talking and share this space.
Gosh, Lynette, thank you for sharing. I think you hit on, thank you for sharing from your experiences, but I think also you can tell from the way you talk about it that you were touching so many different parts of the ecosystem, and it really does sound like it was like communities really having to pull together in the face of COVID-19 crisis, but also with rural challenges and with a ton of other disruptions of people's livelihoods. And so thank you for sharing those challenges. And I think that's part of the value for environmental justice movements is knowing what the conditions are for each other and really working to make sure that there aren't approaches that only help some folks, but not others who live in rural areas or in Alaska with different industries. So thank you so much for sharing. And I think next we're gonna ask Rosette and Leilani, what has the impact been on your communities during this time?
Well, first of all, I would want to say how this isn't necessarily my community. This is more so like the work that I do at Ocean Conservancy, being fortunate enough to being able to find a work that can help me with my own identity and diaspora. We have partners in Vietnam specifically, and I think when we often think about what happened last year and this globalization, we often think that like it's always Western countries that have the means to be able to provide for like developing nations, but from the partners that I'm also fortunate enough to have built relationships throughout the years, that wasn't the case. One issue was I work very much on waste management, and oftentimes we villainize like Southeast Asia as like the place that's like the one that is where all of our trash to the ocean is coming from. But in reality, that's not really the case, like Western countries, there is also trading that happens where Western countries are dumping their trash in Southeast Asia. And that is where the health disparities come in. And I bring that up because, as we know, there's so many Western countries now, the US especially, that have been pouring into Southeast Asia, specifically Vietnam, to create like solutions on the ground for their own communities. But what I've seen, especially with COVID-19, is there are already local leaders in the country that are helping their own people. When COVID-19 hit, a lot of the cities within Vietnam had to close down, and one of which that was impacted with this waste management sector is the informal waste management sector, which are oftentimes migrant women from rural areas to cities. And what happened was it was this own nonprofit called CACR. It's a Center of Environment and for Research that basically created this way of mutual funds to be able to help informal waste management sector workers, to help them with them losing their jobs, finding shelter and whatnot. And we often don't hear those stories of the resiliencies that they do on their own for their own communities. Oftentimes in international development work, we often just hear about the grants that come in and them, the ones that are giving money. But in all seriousness, everything is interconnected. And I guess, long story short, is like, for me, this past year, what I've seen is like, when we talk about environmental justice and globalization, I think we need to also think about how none of these Western countries will really know what the solutions would be on the ground, but for the organizers themselves and the local communities themselves. And I think it just made it more special for me to like realizing that. I mean, even though my home for me is the Philippines, but it's like seeing that happen too in Vietnam, it's like, no, we cannot be villainized anymore. Like, there are already local communities on the ground doing this work, and all we really need to do is highlight them. And I guess I'll pass it on to anyone else to also share.
I'm about to hand it off to Leilani, but just wanted to reflect. Thank you for that international perspective. And it's really resonant because it's always true. Like, the people who are closest to the problem are the ones with the solutions. And yet there's all of this like money thrown in other directions and almost like a savior narrative that continued since colonization. But it's like people who actually fish, people who actually know the water, are in the water, and know those conditions and care for those lands, are the ones who actually like have the solutions. So thank you for sharing. And lastly, last person on this question will be Leilani.
Oh, I'm gonna try to be as like concise as possible, just because listening to Lynette and Rosette brought up so many things that I want to bring to this panel. The disparity and also the difference in privilege that we have in access to resources, like I cannot say how grateful, I can't even express how grateful I am. Like with COVID-19 in the past, we're still in it, we're still in a pandemic, but for me to live in San Francisco and in the Bay Area, yeah, they did rhyme. I got caught up a little bit. Yeah, for me to live in the Bay Area and to have had such quick access to a vaccine is so special. And to pay attention to all the different communities who are still waiting for their cities to even get a shipment of it, to figure out what the rollout of that would be for places outside of the Bay, and then for people to take such deep advantage of things opening up so quickly is extremely frustrating, because just over a year ago, you know, like folks within the Filipino American and Solidarity organizing community were protesting the conditions of folks on the Grand Princess cruise ship. For those of y'all who may not have heard, seafarers and workers on the Grand Princess cruise ship, where an outbreak broke out, were essentially shut down and put into lockdown within the cruise ship itself, which essentially made it a petri dish for COVID if it was as it was expanding, and there was we did lose workers. It took the international solidarity workers to reach out to the respective countries of folks who were working on the ship, including folks from India, including folks from the Philippines, to get different nations involved to figure out, how are we going to get these people back home? How are we going to get them the proper healthcare services? All the while, ongoing things that specifically Filipino American organizers have been working through here is, right, this relationship between America, Canada, and the Philippines. Rosette, you talked about the vilifying of Southeast and South Asians. I think so deeply about how Justin Trudeau, who is like everyone's progressive like heartthrob, chooses to ignore the fact that Canada has left trash in the Philippines and doesn't want to claim it. Oh, my apologies. So there are so many different pieces, but I want to, on a lighter note, I want to add that it was incredible that amongst all of these things happening, we had so much mutual aid relief and such a strong response of, oh, we have essential workers that can't go to Costco to get certain resources for themselves. We have folks who are working and have less time to cook certain meals because they're revving up working at essential stores, grocery stores, convenience stores, pharmacies, folks that work in the health industry. So the community here in the city were able to band together, get restaurants to donate food, people to donate their cars, drivers to donate their time, and get those things spread across the city and throughout the Bay Area. And I saw a lot of that happening. Despite all of the neglect and slow response from local government and from state and federal government, the people had each other's backs. And that's the thing that I think like really allowed us to move forward. And as an educator, what I saw with other educators was creating care kits for students, transitioning immediately into online learning to make sure that the students, while their parents were away at work and they had to stay at home, were making sure and working with parents to make sure that their children were safe. There were so many different levels of community response that goes unspoken and untalked about, whilst there's this like larger conversation of like COVID-19 response and other environmental factors that are happening. But someone asked a question later on that I can't wait to get to, or like in the Q&A, that yeah, the bridge between things that are larger at the larger organizational level and institutional level, and also like this interpersonal level of organizing that I see a lot of us might be a part of as well. But I hope that wasn't too roundabout for the first answer to that question. But I'm already so excited to be hearing from y'all, and excited for the rest of the questions.
Sweet. Thank you, Leilani. Wow, there's so much depth just in the first questions. And I think it really shows, you know, that I think people have a range of experiences and connection, and how important it is of like having people who are ready to respond to interpersonal crises on top of like societally having those safety nets. And so I'm gonna jump to the next question. And it's going to be a bit more like oriented in terms of next steps, to hear, you know, what people are working on and what they'd like to see to make sure that we don't continue to have these disparities, and that our communities get the relief that they need, and also the resources that they need to thrive, and to live and to have, you know, joy and access to things, and not just be in survival mode. This question will be started off by Lynette, and the question is, let me put it in the chat as well. What potential to promote the health of communities and the land do you see with, hold on. Do you see with initiatives such as the Green New Deal or other green jobs proposals? You know, in your point of view, Lynette, like, are these plans that are coming down like sustainable, or what do you think it will take to ensure that these plans are inclusive of all communities? Take it away.
Thank you. For these things, I think that people have politicized climate change so much that they just forget that this impacts everyone internationally, including the US, impacting every other country with climate change. And so things like the Green New Deal, the Thrive Agenda, green job proposals, they allow the government to be able to ensure that people have next steps to do this. But and I will focus on the second question. What will it take to ensure these plans are inclusive of all communities? Is that, like, the people who are being impacted are at the table and that they're being heard. And so what it takes is that steps cannot be taken without asking these communities, without asking every single one of these communities, and especially uplifting Indigenous people. Ancestors stewarded these lands. They had maintained these lands for thousands of years before colonization happened. And even as colonization from extractive industries are happening, they're still stewarding the land. I would say the land back movement is a sustainable way for Indigenous people to sustain the land. And what people get back is a sustainable way to live. And I think that these companies like oil industries who have severely impacted, and factory farming that has severely impacted a lot of people, and they purposely put these things into Indigenous and Black and Latinx and immigrant communities. They do harm. And two examples I can share is how pipelines not only impact the climate through destroying the Arctic, and just the impacts of pipelines to health is, in the Arctic, our elders are getting cancer and dying, and they bring issues with child development to Indigenous women, asthma to our children, and issues with reproductive health, and those things perpetuate something like genocide. You directly impact Indigenous communities in ways that we face the impacts, but not the companies that do it. And another thing is MMIWG, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. They have a direct impact with man camps through pipelines. And so we lose Indigenous women through climate change as well. And people don't realize that when we lose women and when we lose our girls and Two-Spirit people, these women are part of passing down culture and traditions. And we lose that too. We lose ways of life when climate change happens. And I think that some things like the Green New Deal, I think it's great, but when you leave out these communities, you don't get things that work directly to help things like our culture, that give us the ways of life that we have, the learnings we have, the languages that we have. When you take away our people, you take away our cultures and languages, and our traditions, our stories. And so I will close it there and let other people have the floor. And thank you for opening that up with me and asking.
Totally. Thank you so much, Lynette. I think there was like so much there, and I think you really illustrated like a deep connection between, wide scale environmental, the impact of environmental decisions like an oil pipeline, how it interacts with the actual like bodily integrity of Indigenous women and people who are protecting the lands who are being targeted by both the state, the military, people who are, building the pipelines, and also facing violence, and really why it's still important, I would say, also for Asian Americans who don't identify as Indigenous, to ensure that the equitable things that we push for, that Indigenous people are not an afterthought, that it has to actually be led, and actually many of the efforts have been led by Indigenous folks in multiple, like across the US. And so, yeah, totally appreciate that. And next, we have Destiny weighing in on the same question around, looking at these proposed initiatives, Green New Deal and other plans. What will it take to make sure that these plans actually are inclusive and actually do benefit communities on the front lines of climate change?
Yeah, as other panelists have already been sharing, and Lynette's story and like experience, it's just very clear that what it takes is just being directly connected in those communities. Is not a visit in those communities or a pit stop in those communities. It's building strong relationship in those communities, building trust in those communities, and knowing what those communities have already been doing. Because we're not out here looking for someone to be like, hey, give us the ideas and the solutions. We're out here grinding and working on it in our own local communities, in the places that we call home. And it's not bringing in ideas. It's like, what are you already doing locally that's working, that you just maybe need some more support or whatever it is. But it's being connected and in a trusted relationship and listening, and not just only listening, but implementing those changes. And like Lynette said, if anything that is not there, like that, it just shouldn't continue. Like nothing should continue unless it has been approved or has been directly in discussion and communication with the people that are going to be directly impacted. It's that direct impact, because if something is wrong or something that is placed in that community that was not helpful, then those are the people that are going to have to deal with the repercussions. And that is continuously the story of environmental injustice, of like the placement of different, like with redlining or with the pipelines, like this directly impacts those people and continue generational impacts. Like this is not something that are new. These are not things that are like hot topics fresh for 2021. These are generational things that have occurred. So yeah, just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Destiny, for illuminating that. It seems so simple, right? Like people have solutions. They need the funding and resources to do them, and they need to also not be criminalized for living their life and building up their communities. I think so many ways we've seen like people build power and then be targeted and experience violence. And so I think there's so much power in building power, and also people already have solutions. Like stop swooping in and doing other things that make it worse. And yeah, so really appreciate that that answer, Destiny. And for the next question, it will be for Rosette, and it'll be a question specific to the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community. And just wanted to learn a bit, how is that community or our communities affected by environmental racism? Are there any recent events that illuminate how community or institutional inequality and environment intersect to catalyze the unequal effects of environmental catastrophes and within the community? And that could be, the recent heat waves. That could be, there are too many examples over the past year, right, of times when communities have been hit really hard. But just curious if you can offer any examples.
Yeah, thanks, Vic. And honestly, Thank you all, everyone, for holding this space. I can actually think about two examples, one of which is also one that's close to my heart that have also basically helped me start in my own journey of learning about environmental justice is the Laotian community when they organized for themselves. When so the story is in 1991, Chevron oil refinery was in fire. So a lot of people had to move out of their homes. They had to move out of their neighborhoods. But the people that didn't even know that it was happening were the Laotian community and other BIPOC communities in the area. What people that aren't necessary, that have English is not their first language. So they didn't really know. And all of the disaster warnings during that time was just in English, which is, it's messed up because you already know from data that majority of the people in your community are not English speakers. But anyway, it still happened. And it's also in a way the city adding more trauma into the communities, especially the immigrant communities in that area, with disempowering them for like going for their needs and their resources. But what also is amazing about that story is the Laotian community themselves are the ones that organize to fight for their needs and also go to the Richmond city to demand for multilingual disaster warning systems. And they did it, they won. And up until now, they still organize and they help the young generations and the older generation to like not only relearn their own culture, but also in a way, just telling the older generation that like, no, you belong here. You have the power in yourselves to also demand what you need from the city. And to me, that just speaks words, like that just has a lot of emotions tied into it, right? Because it's like, I think as an immigrant, when we do come, we're often shut from certain resources. And of course, it's not just immigrant communities, but it's like, but the fact that when we do join together, we are able to create mutual aids for our own communities. And I think, that is just powerful in itself. And I guess then the second example that I can think of is in our present. Think about climate change and all of this like international negotiations that are going on for like carbon offsets, right? And just thinking about the Pacific Island nations, specifically like Vanuatu, Fiji, and the Marshall Islands, and how they are seeing and experiencing the impacts of climate change, even though they're the ones themselves that aren't they don't have that carbon emissions that is literally destroying our planet. But then at the same time, they're also the ones that are experiencing it, which is like this disparity and this unfairness, right? And then when you bring it into the international community, the conversation is often just like, well, how will we pay for it? But at the same time, it's like, countries such as the US, European countries, they are the ones that created this industrialization and heating of our planet, from colonization and just taking of resources from land. So in a way, it's like, it's interesting to see that in our international, call it whatever it is, there's so many, like the Paris Agreement and whatnot, we often hear from the same people that perpetuated this destruction of our planet, and yet we don't give it to the voices of folks that are already doing the fight and are also experiencing the destruction at the same time.
Wow. Like, yeah, I just agree. I guess I just agree. I thank you for sharing that, of how these things reverberate on a global scale, and how each time it's really important to listen to the folks who are most impacted, but also looking at, those disparities around like everyone has like personal responsibility, but like in terms of like racially and globally, there are different, there's different culpability and reasons why people can't repeat like a savior narrative around like, oh, we're gonna blame certain countries and that type of thing. And so I think our last question before we transition to the Q&A will be on a note of, you know, resilience, and not resilience in terms of like, we're just gonna take it or we're not gonna fight back, but in terms of like, what's our grounding? And so the question will be, oh, it looks like there's an addition. Oh, totally. So before I transition to the last question, I'm going to ask Leilani to share on the last question. Thank you.
Hi, yeah, thanks Rosette so much for that last piece. I wanted to add to that the concept of disaster capitalism. I think it's something that folks don't realize are so prevalent in a lot of coastal community, like especially coastal communities, but anywhere where we experience natural disasters. And it includes things like COVID-19 as a disaster that our communities have experienced, but to kind of tie like to understand what disaster capitalism is, it's when communities go into shock after a crisis or disaster. Those who already have power can capitalize on whatever it is that community had lost. So they thinking of very dense urban communities, whether it's here in San Francisco or other urban places like Metro Manila, right? Local businesses are lost, or family-owned businesses, or businesses that are right on the cusp of surviving at any given moment, lost due to COVID-19, or say a typhoon hits a fishing community. We've talked about climate change and sea level rise in that way. A question that I always ask my students is every community impacted at the same time in the same ways by a crisis or by a disaster? And the answer is no, because what happens when people are starting to finally get themselves back on their feet, or when someone who has power is able to take advantage of a loss in an area, say here in San Francisco, the people that have money can then come into a closed business and open something up that doesn't necessarily cater to the community that business originally served. Or in the Philippines, and I speak a lot on the Philippines because it's where a lot of my background is from, we have coastal communities that are completely lost by typhoons and hurricanes, wiped out, and people live in these coastal areas, people fish in these coastal areas, but now that they're overtaken by trash, that they're overtaken by debris from these disasters, we have people that are already building mega malls and building new condominiums in those places where the people who, again, originally lived there or originally served or worked in can no longer live or afford. And goodness, I lost my train of thought in adding that, but I think thinking about like how the API community is affected in terms of like the disasters that we've experienced, and there's so many in this past year, the importance of like on the ground organizing and this level of education down to our young people, down to whether it's youth and transition age youth, whether it's people in college, and continuing to like educate our elders. There's a reason that like distrust in government exists, and why like people don't want to get vaccines, people don't want to apply for government assistance. There's a reason that the government may offer a resource and our communities completely deny it or don't want to take it because of the vilification of taking advantage of social services, for the vilification of just accepting help and not being independent, even though we're experiencing crisis. So I really appreciate you all for bringing up the different conditions that that many of our communities have experienced, and like why, although it's difficult to both provide and find and share resources, that the on the ground organizing and education and like day-to-day conversations where we encourage people to really know how they can help themselves and like build that independence, rather than say depending on like on something like Red Cross to bring resources that end up never getting distributed, right? Like it's so important, and it's so it's so great to hear all of the different places on the ground that each of us are working on to provide resources to each of our communities, whether Indigenous, whether in homelands, whether in the urban areas or the rural areas that we live in.
Thank you, Leilani. It's really, yeah, it's always really stunning to hear, I think, that each person is working with specific communities and has such a deep understanding. And also, you know, really avoiding climate displacement is so important. I think sometimes I've seen like mainstream environmental organizations say like, this is too important, let's displace them. Like, this is too important, like, let's do this. It's like a desperate rush for like some amount of carbon reduction. And then they don't realize that people interact with the environment. Like the environment isn't just like its own thing. It's actually like people that make it so, and how important it is. Actually, like there are studies about how, like, you know, when people try to do colorblind adaptation for climate adaptation in a city, it actually displaces the people who are the poorest. Or when people, the government has like funds for after a hurricane, like Hurricane Katrina or other ones, if they try to do that in the traditional way, they actually increase the racial wealth gap. People without college degrees, people of color, and people with lower income, like they lose money, while people with college degrees, with income, and who own houses, like have their resources like so increased. And so in a way, the government's actually subsidizing the wealth gap. And it's just, not only is it just like unjust, it's also just so ridiculous to see the funds used that way. Yeah, wow, what a round of questions. I think we'll ask for a quick answer on this last question so that every person can weigh in, maybe just, you know, a minute each. But just, you know, what keeps you going? What grounds you? It could be your vision for what you think is possible. It could be your family. It could be your loved ones. It could be something random like memes or plants. I know those keep me going for sure. If you have a cat, bring them on camera. I'm just kidding. I mean, you could. But we're gonna start it off with Lynette and see what you have to share, Lynette.
What keeps me grounded is really my community and community care, and the way my community and I show up and reciprocate love and kindness towards each other. I think I wouldn't be able to keep going and live through the burnout without them. So thank you to my community.
Ooh, thank you, Lynette. Next up, we have Rosette.
Thanks, Lynette. Honestly, for me too, what keeps me going is also my community that grounds me. I mean, nowadays it's so easy to feel more and more jaded, right? I mean, there's just so many things going on. The ocean was burning. I think it's still burning. But I think what really keeps me going is the community, this communal dreaming of like what the world can be as we pour our hearts into it, our work into it. There's always this joke of like, you know, I think back then it's always like this grind hustle culture of like, oh, what is your dream job? What is their dream job? But now it's like, I don't dream of labor. Like, we shouldn't be. Because in a way, hustle culture is still stems from white supremacy, and being in spaces like this with people that you love and care, your community, and dreaming of that future where it can be better. Like, we can have a world where we all care for each other and not, you know, continue the cycle of just taking and taking.
Beautiful. Thank you, Rosette. And next we have Leilani.
Many things keep me grounded. Short answer, my spirituality and my students, but I'll expand more on my students. I am so lucky, especially now that luckily now that things have opened up, I get to see students in person again. And to see young people actually interacting with each other and like realizing they forgot how to write with a pencil or how to talk to someone that isn't their family. And then also be fully willing to learn about the city, or when I say the city, learn about San Francisco because they've been indoors and stuck inside for so long. I'm so grounded to see students grow and learn, even when like, y'all know, we've all been young people once. We can be really dense. We can be really dense, or we can also say like, well, this doesn't have anything to do with me. Why does it matter? And not realizing that all of these things are connected. So I feel really grounded to be able to provide those connections for young people and allow them to see the power that they have to make change within their own city and their own communities. Oh, Vic, you're muted.
Nice. Thank you for catching that. Just wanted to thank you for sharing. And next up we have Destiny.
Cool. Thanks y'all for hearing it's been keeping y'all grounded. It's been really nice to hear. It's been keeping me grounded. Definitely it's been like my community, as well as spirituality and my garden. I have some corn growing in the backyard now, y'all, and some basil and some tomatoes. And so definitely like that. But the part that has to be a daily thing for me is definitely the vision of the world that I want to see, and what freedom and what liberation can really look like, and not just for me, but for like all people. And what does it collectively look like to just not base love on like transactional things or gifts or profit or anything, but just of care, like the value of care labor. So those are the things that are visionary that have been keeping me grounded.
Beautiful. Thank you for routing us out, Destiny. I appreciated the answers, and I think they're also illuminating because it might seem small to have a garden, it might seem small to have these things that give us joy, but actually they are their own acts of sustainability. They are their own acts of, having things being poured back into you. And I think oftentimes people, I think as we are different, in different advocacy spaces, I think people they want change, but they're afraid. Oh, rounding us out, not ratting us out. But just thinking about, I think that there is some fear in different communities around like, oh my gosh, like what if we did abolish the police? Oh my gosh, what if we did return Indigenous lands back in Indigenous hands? And actually it's a very irresistible possibility, because we can have all the things that we can have a regenerative economy and things that bring life to us. We can buy earrings from Indigenous artists on Instagram. We can have those little connections and things that remind us that there is still care, and there always is those acts of resistance. And so really appreciating all of these notes, and gosh, so much possibility. We're going to transition into the Q&A questions. There are some really cool ones that we've seen so far. And so we're going to jump into the first one, and feel free to add questions if folks think of more. And there also looks like there is a brief survey in tonight's session. So that's also an ask that folks complete that. So the first question is so good. And it's a common one, I would say. It's, how do you think the burden of furthering environmental causes and justice is balanced between individual actors versus larger industries and governments? What do you think the right balance is, and how can individuals create an impact with conjunction to larger policies? There's a lot here, and I can dive into some of it, but if folks feel ready, I think someone said they were interested in answering this question. Was it Leilani?
I did. And I almost think that I know that like Destiny works specifically around Green New Deal with Sunrise. So I'm going to want to pass it to Destiny in a second. But I will just add that in order for us to make larger change, yes, we can do the individual on the ground education, and electoral politics and legislation is not going to be our savior, but understanding how to navigate that and knowing the language and working with environmental law folks and also learning the language on your own, even if it's not something that you studied. There are ways to do your education, understand your personal narrative within environmental issues, and allow that to contribute and change the way that legislation actually supports environmental causes. So I'm gonna give it to Destiny because I feel like she's got a lot to say around it.
Go, Destiny.
Yeah, I'm no expert over here, so definitely wanting to hear from everyone's thoughts. And Leonie, like pretty much exactly what you shared is what I would have said too. But in my own version of what you said, it's really just like, to me, I'm thinking about before, or like stories that I've heard of before we were dependent on the government in a way of like, before we were like looking up and telling like, these are giving basically the power to the government, because I believe that like us as people, we have the power truly, and like also we can give up our power some ways. And I think that truly we can be the people, the government that we want, truly, is my thoughts in that. And I think that like we don't actually, this is, I'm speaking of like my own personal thoughts on this as the city of like, we truly can be and have the community, the care, the acts of justice, what justice looks like, because I haven't recently been seeing too much justice actually being served in the government that we depend on. So I don't really actually too much have any trust in the justice that they have on that, but that also we do have a true responsibility to advocate and uplift and organize for politicians and people in our community that have the same views that will represent us, because like that's honestly the system that we currently depend on. And so we have to make sure it's being advocated and used in our favor. And so that's like getting to know your politician, getting to know what their senses are on things, and being like, okay, are you for my people? And are you clearly saying that in front of all your friends? You know, not just in my face when you're with the people, but continuously. And so that's just, yeah, a little bit of my personal perspective on that.
Ooh, thank you, Destiny. I appreciate, you speaking on, reasons why, different ways that people can influence and make change that might include electoral politics, like Lonnie said, or it might include working outside and figuring out, at which points is engaging in this going to bring up all the things we need. And also the point about not giving up power. And part of power, like part of it is just like believing that you have it. And I think one of the definitions of organizing that I really appreciate is, organizing and political education. It's not about like, forcing information into people. It's actually about unlocking and opening up for people have a sense of the power they already have, and they act like it, they demand it. And collectively we can get all the things we need. And so loving the points in the chat around social media call outs of politicians, love it, because, it like some of the narrative around politicians is like they should just be accountable, and they should. And also, once we have people from our communities in office, we need to continue to hold them accountable, because otherwise they're out of touch. So they start, I don't know, there's some ego stuff going on. I can't really say, but really making sure people have a sense of interdependence. Ooh, some other spicy questions that I'm going to hop to. So I'm looking at them, and I'm going to ask the next one, which is actually, there's two that are kind of related. I'm going to paste them into but basically it's around, with the current political climate on immigration, what do you think is the reality for climate refugees, people who are displaced by climate change as it continues to occur? And how should we in the diaspora like handle climate change displacement of people in our homelands, and is there a responsibility on our end in the US? Because, you know, we're in this interesting position where we are technically in the US on Turtle Island, and there's also these different histories of migration and displacement, and then they're ongoing, like dang. So yeah, if anyone wants to hop on this question.
Go ahead, Lynette. I can go first. I've actually, like, on a personal level, I have been thinking about this a lot, especially, you know, as we continue to learn about the genocide and the colonization and just the traumas that in this land that we currently are residing on are, like, when we talk about ancestral lands, like the activity that we have earlier as a practice, and realizing that, like, as immigrants, what does it mean? I still am trying to figure out this answer, but like, what does it mean of also residing in an area in a certain land that was clearly stolen, but also in a land where you're also constantly being vilified? And it's tricky, right? It's such a sensitive topic, and especially now with like the rise with climate change, and a lot of especially coastal communities with sea level rise are already being displaced by like massive floodings and wildfires too. And it's hard to think, because right now I can't really see any solutions that governments are providing for climate migrants. I mean, even the fact that like internationally there is no protection for like climate refugees and climate migrants, right? But I think thinking of also the power that we have while we are here in the United States and having this advocacy and this our social medias and whatnot, and calling on to our representatives and whatnot, being able to advocate and make sure that we know that is happening, and constantly like pushing the needle, like, hey, we need to do something. It's gonna keep going, and we want to make sure that as climate change happens, people aren't displaced. It's we need to also find them homes, and in the same way provide them resources, but also talking about the history of this land, and also making sure that Indigenous communities and their voices and how they think this should happen should also be heard, and the one that is put on paper in like our policies. I think, like I said, even though I haven't seen it happening yet, I really do believe and trust in the communities that are already organizing with these things.
Thank you, Rosette. I'm really honored to hear about that trust. Like, you know, that I think the stress and anxiety, and also the trust in communities. I think maybe Lynette, did you want to share on this question?
Thank you. And this is a good question, and it is a really difficult question to answer. I think that immigration has always been really complicated, and you know, it is a big thing with our families and with having giant diasporas. And the reality of climate refugees is you know, by the time I'm 50, so in like 30 years, all of my ancestral lands in the Philippines and in Vietnam will be underwater. And so, like, what does that mean for my history, the future of our people? And you know, I want to only speak from personally and my understanding. So you know, during the Vietnam War, my dad is a Vietnam War refugee, and Agent Orange just poured all over the forest, you know, and he was forced to leave. His village was burned down. He could the forests were no longer sustainable for life. And you know, I would consider him a climate refugee too. And so I think I have thought really hard about what does it mean to protect our homelands, our ancestral lands, where our people are from, and lots of like thinking and talking to my elders. And what we can do is dismantle the systems that continue to oppress our people in our countries, specifically the military. The US military causes lots of pollution, things like sex tourism, lots of pollution on our lands. And I think that, and they are a big causation of pollution and climate change. One of the biggest offenders, they are part of the extractive industry. And so I think it is yes, demilitarize, look at this chat, you already know. And participating in getting rid of it, defunding it, demilitarizing our homes, getting rid of the bases on our lands is something that we have the direct power and influence to do. That is something we have the ability to do without speaking over the people who live in the Philippines or Vietnam or where you're from. And you know, sending money, like there's a big indigenous peoples movement, super cruel actions towards the indigenous people in the Philippines. And something to do is making sure you're sending mutual aid directly to where they're telling you to, not some other thing. And yes, that's all I'm gonna share about that.
Thank you, Lynette. I think the military is a really big theme. I don't know if folks already know, but I think there's some statistic about how the Pentagon creates more emissions than like some number of other countries like put together. And so when the Biden's office talks about, you know, intervening in other countries to reduce emissions, it's like, no, it's clearly like motivated by oil and private interests. So definitely keeping an eye on those things in an intersectional way. Looks like Leilani is off mute. Did you want to share?
Very quickly, I want to respond specifically to these questions are very deeply related, but the piece of the question that says, like, how are the diaspora handling climate change displacement of people in homelands, and what's the responsibility on their end? Part of me actually led me to think about, like, what is the responsibility not only of the diaspora, but the responsibility of folks that are like currently living there. I think that I definitely had this assumption when I first started in organizing that, oh, like the communities that my family came from, or like these, right, this concept of the third world, like they need our help, they need to be saved. And I think that's a very common, like if you grew up in America, like we grew up in the nation of Big Brother, and like we're thought to believe that that is the case. There is so much work happening within our homelands, right? It's like the white savior complex. It's how white supremacy like has infiltrated ourselves and like the way that we have relationships with our own land. I want to bring up a narrative or bring up a person named Brandon Lee. Brandon Lee is a Chinese American activist who grew up here in San Francisco and actually moved to the Philippines to do indigenous organizing, and who in doing indigenous and land back organizing there in the Philippines was very much targeted by the Philippine army. And again, going back to that like anti-militarization, we have someone who has American citizenship that is supporting indigenous communities in that land, indigenous communities who are sitting on mines, essentially sitting on very rich natural resource that foreign corporations are the ones that take advantage of. So like when we ask the question, like, is there responsibility on the diaspora's end? And also like who's currently taking responsibility? The diaspora that's in our homelands, and also folks who are slowly decolonizing their existences, whether it's in the States, whether it's in Canada, whether it's in Europe. There is a large solidarity network that is aware of these things that are happening, and people are taking responsibility for that by amplifying those movements, going and doing not relief trips, because that's very colonizer and very like mission oriented, but integrations with these communities and asking what their needs are in the same way that we should be doing that in our own home cities or in our communities here.
So yeah, I just wanted to answer that specific piece of the question because I think it's so important to name that there's so much shared responsibility and they're not separate issues regardless of what land we're on.
Ah, thank you for speaking on that, Leilani. I think it's so important because otherwise we'd end up doing like some type of like classist trip that's also like, you know, still top down and not meeting people's needs, but I think also like getting distracted from what people actually need and what's going on the ground. And so I really appreciate those notes because I think, for example, some like, I guess like better examples are like organizations that are blocking arms deals between their country and the Philippines, or other things like that. So we can still add pressure and move in accordance to make sure that we are adding pressure. And I think also, you know, different instances. So to share, for example, my family, both of my parents were boat refugees during the Vietnam War. And like since then, the policies for refugees have gotten worse. Like they've reduced the amount of time people could spend on aid, and they became much more like focused on like they need to be self-sufficient. We're not going to give them education. We're not going to give them opportunities. And so I think there's also some responsibility for folks who might have citizenship or might have access to other things that you shouldn't need to be able to live a life of dignity, to still advocate for and with folks and empathize with folks who are newer and may not have the same access, but also just like not demonizing people in other communities because because they don't look like you or because they're from other countries. And so just seeing that interconnectedness, I think is so important for intersectional movements. I think we are at time for all the questions, but thank you so much thank you so much to the audience for the questions, and thank you to all the panelists for sharing with such brilliance. It's really a blessing to share space, and I'm glad to know y'all. And I'm cheering you on like forever for your joy and for your fight. And I will pass it back to Balnya. Thanks, y'all.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to Lynette, Leilani, Destiny, and Rosette for your thoughtful conversation this evening. And also a special shout out to our fearless leader, Vic, for moderating tonight's conversation. And another special shout out to Hannah and any other CAPAL staff and board members who are working on all of our behind the scenes to make tonight's webinar possible. And lastly, thank you to everyone for joining us today. Before you log off, there are a few important pieces of information that we would like to mention. First, don't miss out on our upcoming events. Next Wednesday, we have our 6th WLP session. What is your experience with America, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders? Where we'll address the experiences of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders in the US, acknowledging pivotal moments, challenges, and ongoing developments across generations, cultures, and communities. Key topics will include the effects of colonization, generational trauma, identity building, and methods of advocacy and empowerment in today's landscape. Please check out our website on how to register and to view all of our upcoming programming. Visit our website to learn more about us at capal.org. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at CapalDC, and you can also find us on LinkedIn. We would like to take a moment to thank all of our 2021 sponsors as well for their continued support in our programs and helping us to continue to provide opportunities for AANHPIs in public service. Initially an all-volunteer organization, CAPAL has served more than 600 scholars and interns and awarded over $360,000 to support public service careers for both undergraduate and graduate students. Our board members, scholars, and interns have gone on to serve as senior leaders across government, from executive, legislative, and judicial branches to federal, state, and local levels, as well as prominent policy and advocacy organizations. Your valued financial contributions help expand this work. To donate, you can go to capal.org. We also ask that you spread the word about our scholarship and internship program. Opportunities for undergraduate and graduate students open every year in November. Please consider if there are any AANHPI students you know or organizations who may be interested, and tell your University Career Center about us. If your organization is interested in sponsoring us, contact our managing director, Shama Ahmad, for sponsorship opportunities. And finally, we are always trying to improve our programming to meet the needs and expectations of our community. There is a short survey linked in the chat that should take you no more than 2 to 3 minutes to complete. Your honest feedback will be extremely valuable to our future programming, and your contribution is much appreciated. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight, and have a good evening.